Hi, I'm Wendy Turner, Executive Director of Michigan Public. You might have heard that public media is under threat. You're not wrong. But I come to tell you that your voice has power. Visit protectmypublicmedia.org, contact your lawmakers, and take a stand today.
From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Today, the 9 bills.
Bills adopted by the Michigan House and Senate in the last session are now sitting in limbo in the House Clerk's office.
Never making their way to Governor Gretchen Whitmer for her to either sign or veto.
I think that the long-term repercussions for our democracy are real and significant.
On today's show, a constitutional conundrum at the state capitol.
But first, today is what President Donald Trump is calling Liberation Day, announcing reciprocal tariffs and automotive import tariffs. But what will they mean for Michigan? We're joined by David Shepardson, reporter for Thomson Reuters and former Washington bureau chief for the Detroit News, covering all things autos and politics. Hey, Dave.
Hey, Zoe.
So let's just first set the table with the fact that President Trump has not officially announced these tariffs. In fact, they are now not going to be announced until 4 o'clock this afternoon, coincidentally, right when the U.S. stock markets end trading for the day. Dave, let's start with, what are you hearing from D.C. and from Michigan's congressional delegation about so-called Liberation Day?
Well, first of all, it's pretty striking, right? Because normally when you have an announcement of this economic size and import, the auto companies, the lawmakers, the consultants, even journalists, people have a pretty good idea what's going to happen. And this is truly one of those cases where, I think people have educated guesses. They're trying to read the tea leaves the White House has put out, but no one knows for certain what's going to happen. But I think the consensus is from auto companies that they're expecting a pretty dramatic tariff announcement, potentially 20% across the board, nearly all countries. And probably most importantly, for the auto companies, they're not expecting to get these carve-outs for specific parts, right? There are things like wire harnesses that are small, that we don't make in the United States, basically all made in Mexico and a few other countries. And it's going to be exceedingly expensive, at least in the short term, to address these tariffs. So at least in the short term, you're looking at very dramatic tariffs that the auto industry is going to face. And it's really in uncharted waters about how they're going to face it.
How soon do you think we can expect to see the effects of these tariffs hit businesses and consumers?
Yeah, I think fairly soon, although not day one, because a lot of the auto companies have, to the best they can, they've stacked up excess inventory. So if you go to get a car tomorrow, I wouldn't expect a car dealer is going to raise the prices. But I do think in pretty short order, the auto company is going to be faced with pretty difficult decisions. Number one, do we continue to export vehicles from Canada, Mexico, other places when we're facing these pretty high tariffs? Do we try to wait it out? I mean, some auto companies have looked for places to store vehicles temporarily, hoping that this will be resolved. But it's going to take effect in pretty short order. And remember, the other thing is auto companies are going to take pretty soon significant steps to conserve cash, right? Because as they see these prices and they have to decide how much of the tariff hikes can I pass on to consumers, do I have to find cuts elsewhere? That's one of the downstream impacts, not to mention the suppliers who have contracts to sell parts at specific prices. How are they going to handle those tariff increases? We're already seeing a lot of friction between the OEMs and some suppliers about how are we going to deal with those price hikes.
Dave, let's talk about some of the politics behind this. Where is Michigan's congressional delegation in all of this? And is the Trump administration listening to their feedback?
Well, it's pretty interesting, right? Because it's not exactly as clear-cut as you might think. I mean, 'cause you did have Sean Fain,
right,
the president of the United Auto Workers, saying, hey, we support a lot of this plan, and not all of it, right, on the tariff front. Because, their argument is, look, ever since NAFTA and China joined the WTO, Michigan, more than anybody, has seen a tremendous loss of jobs from auto suppliers and in auto production, right? I mean, GM, Ford, and Stellantis all build hundreds of thousands of vehicles in Mexico. Ford builds the Mach-E, GM and Stellantis both build pickup trucks for export to the U.S. as well as other popular SUV models. So I think there are a lot of the union and some Democrats sort of agree with President Trump's general thesis that we need to do more to incentivize U.S. production. I think where they differ is doing it this way. And the problem is to truly get auto companies to shift production back to the U.S. I mean, that's a multi-year process, right? It takes a long time to build auto plants, to move production lines and parts. And so you have to be willing to, if you're the White House, to put up with a lot of pain on the part of higher prices, lower production, lower profits, and suppliers, which are probably on the front edge of potential economic disruption. So that's part of the difference. And then I think the other issue is whether President Trump goes after everybody the same, right? Are we going to treat the U.S., Canada, and Mexico the same way, in some ways worse, right, so far, as we have, China and what happens to the European Union and other traditional U.S. allies. So I think that's the other question, especially coming out of a high inflationary period, right? A lot of these actions, at least in the short term, will have the impact of raising prices to a certain extent.
Yeah, right. And finally, Dave, with all of this, we have to remember, of course, that Trump, could change his mind. Could he end them tomorrow or next week?
Yeah, for sure. And I think if you go back and read the Art of the Deal, he is a deal maker, right? And so what does he like to do? Shock and awe. Day one is always be as aggressive as you can, bloody your opponent in the nose a little bit, and then pull back a little bit or make a deal. And so the question is, once the big announcement comes out, is he interested in making a deal? But the other thing to remember is they're very focused on the revenue. They've talked about $100 billion from auto revenue from these tariffs, right? And if they need that revenue to offset tax cuts and so on, how willing are they going to be to make concessions? That's the real unknown. Is this a true permanent tariff, or is this only the first day of a lengthy negotiation?
That is David Shepperson, reporter at Thomson Reuters, talking to us literally from the Capitol building. Hey, Dave, thanks so much for the time.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, guys.
There is a simmering fight in Lansing right now over 9 bills that are, stuck. They've been passed by both chambers of the legislature, but not yet sent to Governor Gretchen Whitmer.
We are witnessing a constitutional conundrum at the state capitol.
Samantha Schreiber is Capitol correspondent at MERS, the Michigan Information and Research Service, where she covers the state Senate. Sam, hi.
Hello, Zoe. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity.
It's so great to have you.
Let's just start with, how did these 9 bills get stuck in the first place?
Yeah, so the way that I've been describing it is legislative limbo. So I want to go back in time real quick. This is a story that really begins in December 2024, the chaotic lame duck that we all reported on. It is about 6 days before Christmas Day, and we are amid the final hours of the Democratic trifecta control in state government. House Democrats are unable to keep functioning because their caucus was no longer unified. There are very public splits and grievances are aired. House Republicans are outside of the chamber protesting the future of paid sick time and tipped wage in Michigan. So Democrats were no longer able to trade and make deals with them for end of the year votes on policy. Senate Democrats, what they do is they pull an all-nighter, pumping out House bills that they knew might not survive a politically split government. And there were more than 90 of those bills that met that criteria. Flash forward, I'm trying to figure out what all the governor had to sign from that all-nighter. I mean, this is a session that lasted 29 hours.
Yep.
What I found was 111 bills that still needed to be presented to the governor for her to even be able to sign them. Now, keep in mind, if you ignore the holidays, there was more than a 2-week period between Democrats leaving Lansing for the year on December 20th and Republican House Speaker Matt Hall officially becoming leader in the chamber on January 8th. So within that nearly 3-week period, about 100 bills make it to the governor's desk, but these 9 bills are now what are in the legislative limbo.
Okay, so they are in this, remember that old show Lost, like on the island, they can't get out. 9 bills that right now Republican Speaker Matt Hall is basically holding on to. Samantha, what is the reason that the speaker is giving for not transmitting these bills to Governor Gretchen Whitmer?
Ultimately, the argument that you keep on hearing is that these are bills from the 102nd legislature, and it's now the 103rd legislature, that what was left behind by the Democratic trifecta is no longer his responsibility. So near the end of February, and keep in mind, so Senate Democrats filed their lawsuit with the Court of Claims in the state. Judge Seema Patel advised, now she advised, she didn't order or mandated anyone to do anything, but she did advise that the bills be presented to the governor by mid-March. However, Patel, the way that we describe it in our coverage, she did not grant Democrats' request for an official order requiring a government official to perform his or her duties, noting that the procedure is a legislative function in which the court will not interfere. But both Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks, the Grand Rapids Democrat, and House Speaker Matt Hall, the Richland Township Republican, have filed appeals, which means that court proceedings and the story is still unraveling at this very moment.
So, as you said, this case winds up in the Michigan Court of Claims, and Judge Seema Patel rules that the bills should go to Whitmer, but does not issue an order to enforce that decision. That's unusual. And both sides go, yay, we won, but the deadline, in quotes, passes, and Hall still has not sent the bills over.
Right. And you note, Samantha, that Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brinks, who is part of the lawsuit, when asked, she just continues to say that none of this is okay.
I think it's high time that we quit pretending that it's normal for the Speaker of the House to ignore the Constitution and to disregard the judge's orders.
Samantha, what is Brinks doing now?
I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of communication. And I think there is a worthwhile question, and it is, do the people who advocated for these bills have a notable message that the public deserves to have a transparent legislative process that this legislative limbo impedes on? I think that there is a question to be had about the transparency as we try to understand the unusualness of the situation itself.
Sam, we're talking about these procedural machinations, but these bills have policy impacts. What's in them? Yeah. Who are they affecting by not getting their constitutional due to be signed or vetoed by the governor?
So I'm going to focus on two really big proposals that are within these 9 bills that have really, really heavy union support. So when you see Senate Democrats make communications that Hall is harming public safety officials, that he's harming corrections officers, that he's harming public school teachers, these are the bills that they're really focused on. So there was a bill that reverses the Snyder era cap, or the 80-20 cap, on the amount that public employers can spend on healthcare plans. This includes local government agencies, school districts, community colleges. This allows unions such as firefighter unions and teacher unions to come in and make demands that we deserve to have you spend more for our health insurance needs and our health insurance costs. The other thing was adding corrections officers, conservation officers, and motor carrier officers, adding them into the Michigan State Police's Pension Plus retirement program. This was legislation intended to offer those workers more competitive benefits for being in the career long term, offering them guaranteed lifetime payments and retirement income tax exemptions that would ultimately make things like becoming a corrections officer at a state prison a little bit more attractive, because you could get a competitive pension benefits after you retire.
Meantime, Sam, where is Governor Gretchen Whitmer in all of this?
That is a good question, Rick. At the beginning of this year, I covered a committee hearing that Senate Labor Chair John Cherry, he's a Flint Democrat, basically focusing on those 2 proposals I mentioned that are stuck in legislative limbo. And he had told me that the governor has remained silent on the 9 bills. He said he thinks it would be, quote unquote, wonderful if the governor signaled her opinions. The governor right now, I think she is really trying to prove to Michiganders, and would I dare say even trying to prove to national political and policy observers, that she's someone who can be fiscally moderate and really just focus on economic development, building jobs, and protecting jobs in Michigan. And numbers that I just keep on focusing on, regardless of what stories that we're working on this year, is how At the end of fiscal year 2022, the state had more than $13 billion, that's billion for B, left over on its balance sheet when it comes from state revenue that it could spend on once in a lifetime projects and could make investments of its choice. Now, when we think about how much money we're going to have left over in general fund and school aid fund revenues, it's now about $1.8 billion. So a lot less than what we had back then. So with that being said, I think the governor is in a place where I just wonder, does she view such policies such as requiring local governments to spend more on health insurance costs for their workers, doing things such as expanding the people that need to be covered by our pension program in the state? Does she see those as a financial risk?
So, Sam, is what you're saying, is it possible that the reason that Governor Gretchen Whitmer has not said anything or filed her own lawsuit simply just because she doesn't necessarily mind that these 9 bills haven't made it to her desk?
So when I talk to people, when I talk to some of my off-record sources, they say like, oh, well, that is a legislature issue. She's the governor, so she's not going to get involved. But it's not unusual for the governor to invest political capital into a policy. We saw her do that with the firearm legislation at the start of the Democratic trifecta. We saw her do that with the Reproductive Health Act. We saw her do it with clean energy. We've seen her do it with the Prescription Drug Affordability Board proposal. So it's not unusual for the governor to make policy demands out of a legislature. But when it comes to this, she is not spending the political capital to go in front of a podium and to say, Matt Hall, I demand that you send me these bills. And I want to go back to what I said earlier, Zoe. Within the first 72 hours of 2025, there was 111 bills that still needed to be presented to the governor. Over 100 bills. Why is it that 100 bills make it, but 9 are the ones that are stuck? I'm curious, aren't you?
Very. So, Sam, what happens next?
What happens next? I mean, of course, like I said, this is a court situation that can continue to unravel. I'm curious, what happens if this goes to the Michigan Supreme Court after Governor Whitmer is no longer in office, like in 2027? A governor still has the power to sign or veto bills. So where would this legislation even go, depending on a ruling that could be made in the future? I have a legal source that told me the courts usually don't want to get involved into legislative procedure issues. They'll say the general rule is that the judicial branch is not inclined to weigh into disputes between the executive branch and the legislative branch or within the legislative branch.
And Judge Patel signaled that in her opinion.
Exactly. But I do think it is worth keeping in mind. These bills are heavily union-backed, the 2 that I described. The majority of the Michigan Supreme Court is made up of people endorsed by the Michigan Democratic Party. The MDP has a huge union activist presence. So I am curious, do Michigan Supreme Court justices, do they act fast and make a ruling that could be influenced by the Democratic Party members who put them on the ballot to begin with?
That is Samantha Schreiber, Capitol correspondent at the Michigan Information and Research Service, keeping an eye, a very close eye, on the 9 bills. Samantha, thank you so much for the time.
Rick and Zoe, it was such a treat to be on with you too.
Thanks, Sam.
And that is It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Stay dry out there. We will talk again next week.